50 years ago, a group of politicians and thinkers from around the world, called the Club of Rome, came together and asked, how is it that we see these continuous problems plaguing humanity? Poverty, conflict, pollution, disease. Presumably, all these issues are interrelated. But how? They asked a group of scientists from MIT to find the answer. And to do so, these scientists created the first systems model of the world, called World 3. By now, we have a couple of decades of empirical data to see how accurate that model was. And I conducted that data comparison. My name is Gaia Harrington. I live in the US now. I was born in Europe. I work as the Vice President of ESG Research at Schneider Electric, and I'm also an advisor to the Club of Rome. Today I will tell you about my research on that first systems model of the world. So the MIT scientists wrote down their conclusions in a book called The Limits to Growth, which was published in 1972. They published 2 more books over the course of 30 years. What they did with the World 3 model was they had a systems model that had a lot of global variables interact with one another. My first master's was in econometrics. I'm very familiar with the more, I would say, mainstream modeling exercises. These typically are based on a lot of implicit assumptions of constancy. There's not a whole lot of possibility to model a lot of interactions between variables. But if you look at the world, and our society, our economy, those are systems, and a lot of things interact with one another. You see a lot of different kind of movements like delays, tipping points, exponential growth or decay that are hard to capture in the more mainstream models. And so what they did is they modeled population, food, industrial output, pollution, non-renewable resources, human services, which was mostly education and health services, our ecological footprint, and our welfare levels. There were many more variables and a whole lot more parameters in the model, but these are some of the key variables that they were focusing on. What I did then, I looked at the different kind of scenarios that they produced with that model and see which one was most closely to observed data today. They got to these different scenarios by varying the underlying assumptions in the model. Now, these are the 4 scenarios on your screen that I used in my research. Upper left is business as usual. There were no additional assumptions, so they just took historic averages and just let the model run on that. What you see is that produces a collapse, meaning a steep decline around present day. A steep decline is just that. It doesn't mean that humanity will cease to exist. That's why I typically say steep decline and not collapse. However, this business as usual scenario was interpreted as limits to growth predicting collapse. That's not what a systems model does. It's a way to understand general dynamics. But of course, it was a warning signal that we should probably adapt our behavior. Business as usual 2 is also running on historic averages, except that it assumes twice the amount of non-renewable resources. That was a criticism that the team got, that our non-renewable resources, including fossil fuels, for example, are hard to really estimate. And they said, well, you underestimate it. So the team just doubled it to address that criticism. Interestingly, that doesn't avoid collapse. It just causes, it changes its cause from a resource scarcity one in business as usual to a pollution one. Why? Because when we have more, when the resource constraint is relaxed, basically, we can continue business as usual for longer, which then leads to enormous amounts of pollution as a result from that business as usual. I would say that greenhouse gas pollution would be included in that as well. And so business as usual 2 is the climate change proxy. Another criticism that they got and that we still hear today is that people are very innovative, and so we can innovate ourselves out of constraints. So to address that criticism, the Limits to Growth team said, okay, well, we will assume unprecedented levels of technological innovation because that is a factor in the model. We are very innovative. It is not without bounds. Any entrepreneur or researcher knows this. You have to have the idea, but then you have to pilot it and you have to develop it. Then it has to mature, and then you still have to scale it. This typically takes about 10 years. Nonetheless, it was assumed that this was much higher than it has historically been for people. That does change how the scenario develops. We still see declines, however, we don't see as steep a collapse as in the business as usual scenarios. The fourth scenario is stabilized world. That one deviates significantly from historical averages. The key difference with the other one is that in stabilized world, humanity changes its societal priorities. So instead of pursuing industrial output, which resembles our pursuit for economic growth, in stabilized world, humanity refocuses on meeting human services, so education, healthcare, and all the technological innovation is diverted towards pollution abatement and increased efficiencies. Given these quite different scenarios and different developments, I thought it would be interesting to see how empirical data is holding up. Are we following business as usual still? Are we following a different scenario? That would be preferable. So I conducted that. I just took data from World Bank and United Nations agencies, etc. It was then published in Yale's Journal of Industrial Ecology, and a few months later it was picked up by a bunch of media outlets, and some of which had these headlines that you're seeing here to give you a little taste. However, my findings were a little bit more nuanced than these headlines, so let me tell you about that. This is a general impression of what I found. There were many more variables in my research. This is the birth rate. Some variables matched even more closely, some less, but this in general is what I found, an overall close alignment of empirical data with the 4 scenarios. Why all of them? Well, they haven't diverged much yet. As you can see, they show very different paths for the rest of this century. But right now, they haven't diverged much yet. Still, I was able to identify a closer fit to 2 scenarios, business as usual 2 and comprehensive technology. These 2 scenarios are diverging later, and so it wasn't possible yet to distinguish between them. But still, they will diverge in World 3 soon and show different paths in the future as well. The least close alignment was with stabilized worlds, the one in which declines are avoided. So what does that mean? Well, I interpret my findings as that we have a now or never moment in time to determine the future of humankind. There are moments in history where not that much happens. This decade is not one of those times. We are, if we take World 3 and its output seriously, and given the close alignment to the scenarios, decades into the future, I think we should. And if we do that, then we might be right now at the peak of human welfare levels. So the question is not, can we continue to grow it according to this model? The question is, do we want to stay here, or are we going to behave in a way that we'll see steeply lower levels of human welfare for the rest of this century? So as you can see, this is the human welfare variable. Again, very close alignment, very different paths going forward. Stabilized world shows with a small dip somewhere in the middle of the century um, that we can hang on to our current welfare levels. However, as I said, that would necessitate enormous behavioral changes on a global scale of humanity. We're not that far removed from stabilized world yet. As I just said, I still found a close alignment to all four scenarios because they haven't diverged much yet. So although we are least close to stabilized world, we're not that far removed yet where we can't realign ourselves, but it would have to be a conscious decision. We will not automatically get there. We are not on track today. Sometimes I get into the discussion of, well, but we're probably following comprehensive technology, right? Um, the truth is that nobody knows the future for certain, and so it's a little bit of a not that interesting discussion. Um, we could go into the details of the assumptions, which I think are unrealistic. However, I don't think it's a good discussion to have because even comprehensive technology is not the best case scenario, and we should aim for that. Why? Because stabilized worlds, what it represents is not, it wouldn't shifting priorities away from growth towards human services, health and education, and a better environment. That's a better life anyway. It's not a capitulation to grim necessity. It's a world where we choose life over growth, and that's really, I think, the key finding of my research. Yes, we have to redefine our core values, but it will not just avoid collapse. It will lead to a society where we are happier, and I think that's relevant. I'm, of course, not the only person who has come up with that. We see this all over the world. We see people proposing other kind of indices. This is from the OECD, the House Life, the Better Life Index. We see well-being economists, Kate Raworth, for example, her donut is in here that says, well, maybe the goal of the economy is not continuous growth and measured by GDP and profits, right? Maybe it's well-being within ecological boundaries. We see governments now, um, a few of them, but still it's a start. We see governments saying, well, we want to be governing by well-being. So we have the WeGo, the well-being governments. Scotland is in there, New Zealand, Iceland. Bhutan is not in there, but that has also had a happiness index for a very long time through which it governs. So we see these things happening already around the world. Why? Because growth makes sense as long as it caters to human needs, right? And I think if you're if still a developing economy, growth makes sense. It does make you happier because your basic human needs aren't met yet. Once your basic human needs are met, more stuff doesn't make you happier. You get to these higher levels of the Maslow pyramid where you just get more life satisfaction from things like connection, purpose in life. And that's the thing. Growth for the sake of its own, for just growth, it's not a good purpose. It feels very empty, and that's why what you see that the growth, especially in OECD countries, it has mostly spurred income and wealth inequality, which actually makes it harder for us to connect. So the growth is not really delivering much for us anyway. And again, it really isn't. I'm not anti-growth. I don't think that letting go of growth means you're anti-growth. It just means, well, how about we just find a better ultimate purpose for society than continuous growth? What has the Club of Rome done since then? Of course, they've been thinking about this as well. How do we move from this concept of never enough, right, to a concept of enough for each? They, of course, like many others, including me, know that the time for incremental change is over. We need a transformation. We need enormous changes, deep systemic changes, and we need them very, very quickly. So how do you do that? Well, if everything is interconnected, there is actually a way to make use of that if you understand how things interrelate a little bit. They created, therefore, a new model of the world in their Earth for All project. This one was to understand global dynamics enough to identify the leverage points. If you know leverage points in a system, you can make use of the interconnectedness. People in business call this synergies, right? So they don't represent importance. Just because something is not a leverage point doesn't mean that if you're contributing to that, you're not doing important work. So I just want to make that clear right from the get-go. But if you want to work in a leverage point, knowing that what you do indirectly also triggers a lot of other things around that to set off this transformational change that we need in the world. These are the 5 leverage points you could choose to work in. The first one is energy. I think that's obvious. We all know what needs to happen there, right? It's already on their way, of course. It needs to be ramped up. But renewable energy, more efficiency, and electrify everything that we can electrify. Equality, like I mentioned, income and wealth inequality is arguably the social twin of the climate crisis. It rips societies apart. Poverty, there's also enormous inequality between countries, not just within countries, and the poorer countries do need new growth models because, like I said, their basic human needs aren't met yet. But they can't grow in a way that the West or OECD countries have grown in the past because it's too environmentally polluting, and so that's something that we need new growth models for. Food is, we need more food for a growing population, but the way, again, we do it now is too polluting. It asks too many resources. There's a lot of solutions there. Regenerative agriculture, we can change our diets away from so meat heavy. We throw away about 40% of our food in the US. It's a little bit lower, like a third overall in the West, but obviously that seems like a lot of waste. All of these things we could do much better. And then the 5th one is empowerment, education, liberty of marginalized groups, especially women. There's a lot to unpack around gender equality, but in general, it just seems to make sense that if you need such enormous changes in the world, probably not a good idea to underutilize half the population. Those were the key messages of my research. And really also the ultimate message of Limits to Growth half a century ago. It was never a doomsday prediction. It was a vision for a better world. And I think my research shows that we still have that opportunity, although it's a now or never one. So maybe choose wisely what we do in the next decade. Thank you. These are some links. Of course, the journal article itself, the Earth for All website, if you want to know more about those leverage points and how to work in that and all those things. I am on LinkedIn if you want to add me. I will also be posting there my book once it's done. It's under peer review right now. It will be available freely online for everybody with an internet connection under Creative Commons. Thank you very much.